And welcome back to the program. It's the Vicki McKenna Show. Standing by on the phone on the BlueLineBrews.com hotline is Jason Church. Jason's been on the program before. Last time we had Jason Church on, it was after the abrupt pullout from Afghanistan. But Jason has been a congressional candidate. He was an aide to Senator Ron Johnson, and now he is heading up the Wisconsin, group supporting U.S. term limits. As I understand, this is the oldest term limits organization in the country, U.S. term limits. And Jason's on the phone with me right now. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me again, Vicki.
My pleasure. So let's talk about term limits, shall we? Because there are two groups of people that I would like to see term limited. One group are elected members of Congress. Another group are the people who just sort of wander around when elected members of Congress leave and find themselves another little cubby hole, and that's staff. Staff, I wonder if aren't as big of a problem. But let's start with what U.S. term limits is all about, what the Wisconsin group is going to be pursuing, and how you're going to help.
Right. So U.S. term limits is really focused right now on getting members of Congress to be limited in the amount of time they can be serving on Capitol Hill. And this is something that's very popular throughout the United States. 80% of Americans support term limits on Congress. And there's a lot of reasons why, but you can really just look at the recent track record of Congress and get an answer. You have never seen in the last 15 years congressional approval rating go over 40%. And at times it's been in the single digits. And I have a reason why. We've had people there for way too long. I mean, I can give you three names right now: Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and Mitch McConnell, who have been in office for longer than I have been alive. I mean, this is ridiculous. And what it does is it creates a situation where these people have amassed a lot of power over the last 30 years and have done everything in their power to make sure that they're focusing on winning the next election and not legislating the needs and concerns of Americans.
Well, and I can't speak to Pelosi and Schumer as, what the Democrats' mindset is, because it's been too long since I've been one. But Mitch McConnell, instead of attempting to, strategize the best course of action for America, I know is strategizing the best course of action to regain power. I think Chuck Schumer, instead of strategizing the best course of action for America, is strategizing the best course of action to hang on to power. So when that's all it's about, we end up getting cut short. And that is not something. When was the last time you saw an agenda come out of either the House or the Senate that had America and our interests, your interests, Jason, mine, as middle-income Americans or people who want to save Social Security, make sure our retirements are going to actually be able to be sustained? When was the last time we were on the list?
I don't know. I may not have been alive or certainly old enough to comprehend. I think that this goes on to exactly what you're saying, because the problem is that the focus is on the next election instead of exactly what you're saying right there, which is the tough issues. When you're talking about the rising debt, when you're talking about getting real infrastructure, not the stuff that's going on right now in the Congress, but real infrastructure bills passed, or immigration reform. I mean, this is something that has been sitting in the halls of Congress for decades, or simplifying the tax code. I mean, you name some of these things that only Congress can do, and they're punting it every single time because they are tough, and it's going to require them to make tough votes. And that could lose them an election. But if you're limited in the amount of time you can stay there, you begin to prioritize different things. And in my opinion, I think for the better.
I do too, especially if you're, and how many term limits? We've got the Convention of States legislation that I believe was pretty generous in terms of the amount of time that somebody would be permitted to serve. But what is sort of the ideal sweet spot, do you think?
So at U.S. term limits, we think 6 years in the House and 12 in the Senate. And I think that that's 3 terms in the House, 2 in the Senate. And I think that at that level, you are able to go in, do what you've been elected to do, and then move on with life. Because this was not created. These positions were not created to become careers. They weren't created for you to go hang out in Washington and get a posh apartment over here and chill for 30 years. It was meant to go and do a duty and come home. And to me, I just think that we've gotten so far away from that because of the perpetual mentality that exists in Congress right now, which is about what you were saying earlier, about advancing particular parties' best interests in the case of Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi.
Or your own personal interest. Or it becomes personal, too, at some point, getting rich. How many people have gotten rich because they've served in Congress? You know, the other thing that happens is you end up developing very cozy relationships with lobbyists. And I think it's probably harder the shorter amount of time you spend there. The longer you spend there, the more you think the lobbyists ought to call the shots.
Yeah, and this is because I often, when I've discussed term limits with other members of Congress or people who have been in Washington for a while, they'll argue and say that the lobbyists will take over if term limits are implemented. And I kind of laugh. I'm like, I mean, as if the lobbyists aren't already, very entrenched with the people we elect. And I think that all the arguments that typically are pushed against term limits usually center around the idea that either bureaucrats will take over, lobbyists will take over, or that it takes years to be able to understand what goes on in the legislature. And I laugh at all of these because you want to tell me that AOC understands what's going on in the legislature right now? It doesn't matter at that level. To me, this is just a red herring away from me not wanting to give up power if I'm a member of Congress.
I want staff gone too, though. The entrenched, institutionalized, mire is also part of some of the historical staff that's been there. That's probably something that's going to be a piece of legislation that says we're going to change the way civil service protection works. But you get rid of people's, need to hook up with lobbyists in order to stay in power. And because you take away necessarily take away the ability to stay in power. And I think we're off to the races because, at some point, someone's got to put us on the list, at least on the list at some time. We're not on the list. Jason, this pisses me off so bad. Look at the agenda the Democrats are rolling out. And quite frankly, with the exception of some good, easy to identify outliers, look at the agenda the Republicans are putting up. What agenda says we're going to close down the border? What agenda says we're going to stop inflation? What agenda says we're not going to, get ourselves to the point where we get a debt crisis and wipe out 2/3 of the budget? Nobody's agenda has any single American on its list to help.
There's no incentive for it right now. And unfortunately, it's just, again, about being reelected, and that's why term limits are important. And I think that one of the things that I need to explain on radio, certainly for listeners, this actually gets done. Because people have talked about term limits for a couple decades, and it's been something that's kind of been kicked around. But I think it's important to understand how this happens. And this is going to require an Article 5 convention. And to explain to your listeners a little bit, what it requires is the states were given this power through the Constitution in Article 5 to call on a convention when they felt that the federal government was not responding to the needs of the citizenry. And this is one of those situations. So what the legislature can do in Wisconsin is vote to convene this convention.
Yep.
And I would encourage your listeners to reach out to your state senators and state reps about this and tell them to support calling for this convention, because that's the way it starts. Because then if you get 2/3 of the state to agree to the convention, and then if they ratify it by 3/4 after they agree to the term limits, then it becomes an amendment, and it escapes Congress's overreach in this situation, and it escapes Congress's ability to try and claw anything back. And this is something that we have not done through this process yet in the U.S., but it was put there for situations exactly like this, where the federal government is no longer responding to the needs of the people, and the founders of this nation understood that a tyrannical government could do something like this, and they put a safeguard in, and this is exactly what it's meant to be for.
Right now, I believe the legislation, it's not legislation, that's the wrong word for it. The actual document is before the state Senate. I believe the Assembly has already gone forward on that. And so we are very close to being, I think we would be state number 19 that would ratify this. And there is, I've had Mark Meckler on this program from Convention of States. They are working across the United States to get enough states so that we can actually finally call the convention and we can actually finally address there are a few things that people want to address, but two of the main things are term limits and a balanced budget and spending within our means. And those are two things Congress will never do, ever, ever, ever do on its own volition. If you don't want a debt crisis, which basically means we're all going to be living in bombed out cities, hand to mouth, not figuring out, whether or not we're going to be able to keep the heat on. If you don't want that, then you probably should do something to rein in this out of control spending.
It's 80% of Americans support it. This is something that we have to push legislators to do in our state to then force the Congress to do something. Because exactly what you're saying right there, Congress won't do it on its own. It's proven its inaptitude to do this. We've had people, Ron DeSantis supports this. There's a lot of people who support this across the country who understand the magnitude of what term limits can bring to the functionality of our government, and it's time that we make our voices heard.
Yeah, and so this is about picking up the phone and calling, particularly calling your senator, Democrat or Republican, and saying we've got to make Wisconsin part of this process, and then let these guys go on and find another state that they can work on in order to call this convention. Otherwise, I don't know if America's gone as an idea. I think that it never dies as an idea. I don't think freedom goes away, Jason, but I tell you what I do see. I do wonder if we're not going to find ourselves in a place where we are miserable for decades before we get our collective heads out of our butts and realize that we had the power to change this all along. And I just don't want to live through decades of hell. I would rather only live through a couple of, bad presidential terms of hell.
Vicki, this is a fight for our, my kids and grandkids, because if we don't implement this stuff now, like you're saying to me here, this is a snowball. It's going to roll downhill, and it's going to keep getting worse and worse until we rein it back in. And we have an opportunity to do it now. Yeah,
and we're getting closer and closer and closer. Within our lifetimes, we could see this actually happen. Jason, where can people find out more?
So go to USTermlimits.com if you want to learn a little bit more about the project and a little bit more of the policy details and nuance, full of information and the people who support this, and those that we have endorsed as candidates across the board who have signed pledges to uphold the term limits, either voting for it or being an advocate for it.
Jason Church on the program, U.S. Term Limits, the Wisconsin chair. Thanks so much for joining me, Jason.